Scott Shatto is a science educator and communicator. He's interested in deep sea ecology, climate change, and using good science to inform policy. He's an avid runner, a musician, and an ultimate Frisbee player. And indeed, he is the architect of the rap video on citations. Please welcome Scott Shatto.
Well, hi, everyone. Thanks for coming today. My name is Scott Shatto, and the title of my project is Breathing Easy: Recommendations for Communicating Ocean Deoxygenation to Policymakers. Now, if I were to ask all of you if you were familiar with the term ocean deoxygenation, I think most of you would probably say you were, because you're either scientists here, or you work at Scripps, or you've heard me blab on and on about it for about 4 months. But if I were to ask a group of total strangers if they had ever heard of ocean deoxygenation, I'd probably get a very different answer. And in fact, that's what I did. I went out and I asked 20 different people, some of whom had science backgrounds, some of whom didn't, what they thought of when they heard the term ocean deoxygenation. And the responses I got were pretty interesting. Some of them were not too far off base. Some people thought of dead zones when they thought of ocean deoxygenation. Some people thought of dead fish, which are of course relevant. And one person even told me they thought of low levels of dissolved oxygen because of nutrient runoff. I also got some really strange answers to this question. Somebody told me they thought ocean deoxygenation sounded like a villainous plot from a Despicable Me movie. And one person told me they thought it sounded like the vacuum ship from Spaceballs that sucks all the oxygen out of the ocean, which I thought was actually not too far off base. Given this, I thought it was prudent to investigate how we could raise awareness of ocean deoxygenation for an audience that could really make a difference. So for my Capstone project, I created a set of recommendations on how to best communicate ocean deoxygenation to California policymakers. Now, all these ideas are interesting, but they're not the true definition of ocean deoxygenation. The real definition is a decrease of oxygen in the oceans because of human-caused climate change. Now, unfortunately, ocean deoxygenation is happening globally across all of our oceans and at all depths of our oceans. And in fact, a study that came out in 2017 found that 2% of our global ocean oxygen has been lost since 1960. And it's projected to go down by a few percentages by the end of the century as well. And even though it's happening across all of our globes and all of our oceans, it's not happening uniformly across the oceans. Some places are feeling the effects of ocean deoxygenation more than others, including right here in California. The Monterey Bay area has experienced a 40% loss of oxygen from 1998 to 2013 at about 250 meters depth. And the Southern California Bight has experienced a 21% loss of oxygen from 1984 to 2006 at about 300 meters depth. Now, if 40% and 21% are a little obtuse to you, think of it this way. If we were to breathe 40% less oxygen, that'd be like us hiking up a mountain to about 10,000 feet and living there for quite a while. It's hard to breathe up there. It's a little bit taxing. So this is what some of the animals in our ocean are experiencing. Now, even though ocean deoxygenation sounds complicated, and sometimes it's even hard to say, the mechanisms and drivers behind it are not too complex. In fact, they can be boiled down to some simple messages. First of all, climate change is warming our planet, and as our planet is warming, our oceans are slowly starting to warm. And as our oceans warm up, the solubility of oxygen decreases. This means that it's harder for oxygen that's in our atmosphere to enter at the surface of our water through wave action or diffusion, so less oxygen is getting in. As our oceans warm up, this also increases the stratification of ocean layers, kind of like the layers on this cake here. As natural layers form in our ocean, but as the ocean gets warmer, these layers become more defined and more distinct. And this makes mixing between these layers really difficult. So oxygen that's in our water is having trouble getting dispersed throughout the ocean. And warming waters also increases the respiration rate of animals that live there. Just like if you guys were to go outside right now and take a run, you would probably get really hot, maybe overheated, and you would need more oxygen to breathe. Animals in the ocean are experiencing this too. As the water warms up, they need more oxygen to survive. And this kind of creates a negative feedback loop because as our oceans get warmed up, there's less oxygen getting in, but animals that live there need more oxygen to survive. But why do we actually care about ocean deoxygenation? Well, we should care because it impacts a lot of ecosystem services that we rely on, including our fisheries. What you see on the screen here is a diagram of something called an oxygen minimum zone. And these are zones in the ocean that are naturally occurring with really low concentrations of oxygen. And as ocean deoxygenation is happening, these oxygen minimum zones are increasing in size. And this limits the space that ocean animals can live in because they can't live in these areas with really low oxygen. So this is forcing animals to be compressed into smaller and smaller living spaces, which makes them more vulnerable to predation from other fish, but also from fishing and humans. So this can impact our fisheries. Now, ocean deoxygenation is usually considered a multi-stressor associated with other climate-related issues, specifically to ocean acidification. And ocean acidification and ocean deoxygenation are actually quite similar. They're both ocean health issues related to climate change. They both have kind of complex mechanisms that can be boiled down to more simple messages. And they both started becoming prevalent in the literature about 2 decades ago. In fact, ocean acidification started popping up in the literature about 20 years ago, and ocean deoxygenation started showing up about 10 years ago. So, given their similarities, I thought it was a good idea to look into how ocean acidification has been communicated over the years to help build my set of recommendations on how to communicate ocean deoxygenation. And looking into the story of ocean acidification, it turns out that it's pretty interesting. It starts with this place right here. This is called the Whiskey Creek Oyster Hatchery. And this hatchery is responsible for raising about 75% of the oyster larvae that goes to shellfish fisheries throughout the Pacific Northwest. In 2006, this shellfish hatchery experienced a mass die-off of its oyster larvae. About 80% of its oyster larvae died. And this was really concerning to people in the industry because the shellfish hatcheries there are responsible for generating a lot of money. They generate about $270 million annually for the Pacific Northwest, and they generate about 3,200 jobs. So when this mass die-off happened, they got really concerned. So they partnered with local scientists, the local university, and they found out that the culprit for this die-off was ocean acidification. And once they figured that out, they started talking to people. They went out to their local community, started telling community members about it. They started talking to policymakers. And after they started telling this story, some funders got interested and eventually reached out to various NGOs, specifically the Ocean Conservancy and the Ocean Foundation, to start advocacy divisions within their organizations to talk about how best to approach community interaction and how best to approach policy. After NGOs got involved, other advocacy networks started to form, including the California Current Acidification Network. And this was a conglomerate of a lot of different stakeholders, from community members to people that were in local government and also local tribal members. And this was supposed to make ocean acidification information more available throughout the country. After these networks got involved, we did see our first piece of legislation in Washington State in 2012. The governor up there formed the Washington State Blue Ribbon Panel on Ocean Acidification. And this panel was charged with consolidating scientific information about ocean acidification, identifying any research gaps, but most importantly, developing recommendations on how to address ocean acidification. Now, after Washington State did this, California got a little jealous. And they decided that if Washington State thinks ocean acidification is a big deal, maybe we should start thinking about it a little bit more often. So they formed their own West Coast Ocean Acidification and Hypoxia panel. And this was made up of a bunch of representatives from all up and down the West Coast, and they built a similar set of recommendations for the West Coast. Out of these recommendations came 2 pieces of legislation in California that helped found the California Ocean Acidification and Hypoxia Task Force. And ironically, this task force is why 2 of my committee members can't be here today, because they're on that task force right now in Sacramento talking about ocean acidification. Now, this is kind of a good overview of the ocean acidification story, but of course a lot is happening behind the scenes. But I looked at this and kind of decided if I could translate any of this to ocean deoxygenation, and I think that we can. First, we need to start by creating a narrative. Just like how ocean acidification had the narrative with the Whiskey Creek Oyster Hatchery, we need a narrative like that, and I think there is one. In 2006, around the same time that the Whiskey Creek Oyster Hatchery was experiencing their die-offs, there was a mass die-offs of Dungeness crab off the coast of Oregon. And one newspaper wrote this about it: the most severe low-oxygen ocean conditions ever observed on the west coast of the United States have turned parts of the seafloor off Oregon into a carpet of dead Dungeness crabs and rotting seaworms. And if this doesn't lend itself to a precautionary narrative about the dangers of ocean deoxygenation, I'm not sure what does. After we start constructing this narrative, we can get various NGOs involved and nonprofits involved to help write legislation, draft pieces of paper that we can actually put in front of legislators and force them to take a stance on ocean deoxygenation, but also force them to become familiar with ocean deoxygenation. Through these pieces of legislation, we can help create champions within Congress, people that are experts about ocean deoxygenation that can co-sign bills, but also advocate for it in the local government. We also need to make ocean deoxygenation a research priority. In scientific panels that focus on ocean acidification or other climate change stressors, we need to make sure ocean deoxygenation is on equal footing. We also need to inform the public about ocean deoxygenation. Policymakers are supposed to represent their constituents. So if their constituents are passionate about an issue, policymakers should be passionate about that too. And in order to inform the public, we need to make ocean deoxygenation more approachable. So in the vein of making it more approachable, as a part of my project, I developed a few visual representations of how ocean deoxygenation can be better explained. One of them is a brochure, and this is it here. This brochure I created back in the early part of the year to be handed out at COP23 in Germany this past year. And it outlines 7 important things about ocean deoxygenation. I also developed this infographic here. This infographic is more for a non-scientific lay audience, and it goes over the main drivers and mechanisms of ocean deoxygenation. And the purpose of this infographic is to really help raise awareness of the issue and to help start a conversation, and also point out where you can go to find more information. And this is kind of a more general, very kid-friendly version of this infographic. I also developed one more infographic, and this one is directly for policymakers. So this is intended to be handed out directly to policymakers in order to tell them how ocean deoxygenation can impact important commercial fisheries here in California. Now, ocean deoxygenation sounds complex, and I probably stumbled over that word a few times here in this presentation, but it doesn't need to be intimidating. Its message can be boiled down to very simple messages, starting with human-caused climate change is causing our oceans to lose oxygen. And just like you and me, most ocean animals need oxygen to survive. If we can get this message into community members and local organizations, perhaps we can get this message to policymakers so they can start making policy to help mitigate the effects of ocean deoxygenation. I'd like to thank my committee members for helping me out with this project, especially Jen Smith, who's here today. And also everyone that contributed to my infographics. It was a big group effort, so thank you for everyone that helped with that. And now I'm available for any questions that you may have.
So if folks have questions, please just raise your hand. We have mics in the back.
Nice.
Thank you. I have my question is, in the very beginning you were mentioning 2% globally, I believe, and up to 40% in the Monterey area. And California seemed to be perhaps harder hit than most places. And I'm wondering if this might be, is this related in any way to like La Nina or El Nino, with the warming of the waters?
Yeah, I think that can have effect on oxygen in the water. I think it's more affected by upwelling in the system here off California. That has some impacts there. And those were just 2 examples that I really highlighted here because I was focusing on California. There are losses that are kind of equal to that happening throughout the world. And the 2% loss in oxygen really is not the main story. That's what we've lost total throughout the entire globe. But those more higher percentages losses are really important. But I think it's more related to different kind of coastal stressors happening as well, especially like eutrophication that happens along coastal areas throughout like the Monterey Bay area and the Southern California Bight as well.
Hi, Scott. Thank you so much. That was a great presentation. You know, I was wondering, there were pictures that showed you guys all going to Sacramento. I was wondering, first, did you try any of these conversations or presentations in front of these policymakers to see what sorts of responses you might get?
I didn't, no. So Sacramento was a little bit before I started to kind of developing these recommendations, but in Sacramento, I was given the chance to talk to people very familiar with policymakers, and I got a lot of great advice about how policymakers don't necessarily care about issues unless they impact their constituents and impact the economy and other things that directly relate to the welfare of the state. So that was one of the big struggles that I was dealing with is ocean deoxygenation it's happening everywhere, but it's also happening in the open ocean. How can we get policymakers to be passionate about something or care about something that's really happening far off the coast? And I think it's kind of how you approach your story and how you tell that story and create that narrative. So I wasn't able to test any of these things on policymakers in Sacramento, but I was able to get some really helpful advice when I was up there.
That's great. Thank you.
Great. Hit me, Caitlin. One more.
Sorry. Scott, that was a fantastic presentation and very timely, I think, in where we are in our ocean issues. So I'm curious what your next steps are going forward from your project, what you're doing to communicate ocean deoxygenation or other ocean issues.
Great, thanks. So I'm planning on distributing a lot of these materials to various NGOs throughout California, hoping that they can get this, read a little bit more about it, realize that it is a big ocean health issue and start taking some action on it. Personally, I'm looking to get more involved in policy. I'm a finalist for the Canals Fellowship, so hopefully I'll be going to DC to get a little bit more involved in that. But I'm looking to tie climate issues and science into policy a little bit more as well. Thank you, guys. Oh, one more.
Yeah, sorry. So I'm a teacher, a high school biology teacher in Northern California. You talked a little bit about making, this particular topic more accessible. What would you possibly say, or what would you want a high school biology teacher to focus on this particular topic to teach those next generation scientists?
Yeah, I think that ocean deoxygenation is really closely tied to climate science. So if you're talking about climate change, this is a really easy topic to tie into. And I think even though the mechanisms behind it can be complex, and there's a lot of things that I didn't talk about here that's going on, I think that kind of the three main points that I talked about are pretty easy to understand, that if you warm up water, less oxygen gets in. If you're warmer, you need more oxygen to survive. And this can be related to students as well. So I think kind of making those general connections for a high school class can be really effective, but also providing them with materials like some of the infographics that I made to more visually represent what's going on here would be a good place to start. Yeah. Thank you, guys.